start by thanking you both for joining me today, Will and Eric, to talk about this amazing research project that you've just completed. I really appreciate you taking the time to do that. Can we start just by introducing ourselves so that everybody knows exactly who's done the research and a little bit about your background? Will, do you want to start us out?
Sure. Yeah. So my name is Will Payne. I'm an assistant professor of geographic information science here at the Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers University. And I've been in this role since 2020. And I'm in my own research, do a lot of work with spatial data about urban inequality. So I work on everything from local reviews, geospatial mapping platforms, and kind of smart cities research. But that has led me into this kind of housing related research along with Dr. Seymour, Eric here, and other colleagues as well. So really interested in kind of what makes our cities, what makes them tick, what makes them affordable or increasingly unaffordable for many of the people who live in them.
I'm Eric Seymour. I'm an assistant professor of planning, also at the Blaustein School here at Rutgers. I joined the school in 2019. My work focuses very much on housing affordability and housing policy. A lot of my research, beginning in my time in Michigan before coming to New Jersey, has focused on investors in a variety of housing markets, but focusing first on places in the Midwest that experienced substantial amounts of subprime mortgage lending and foreclosure. And then I branched out to look at the Sun Belt, places like Las Vegas in particular, but also Atlanta, where you have other types of investors that I think we'll talk about more at length in the interview. But I'm very interested in um, these post-crisis transformations in housing markets and
Mhm.
the kind of conditions of housing insecurity that this has produced, but produced in different ways in different contexts. So trying to unpack these like very housing market specific situations across the US. And doing great work with Will and also with Professor Kathy Newman, also a co-author on our report.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I appreciate that intro because it kind of leads us right into the subject matter. So today we're really going to be talking about a research project that you did looking at corporate ownership of small multifamily units at in some municipalities in New Jersey. But before we get into sort of the meat of the work that you've been doing recently, this kind of fits, generally speaking, into this housing trend that's often called the financialization of housing. Could you talk a little bit about what that is, where it comes from, what it means for people who are owning homes, renting, trying to get into the housing market, kind of provide a little context?
Sure. So this term, the financialization of housing, that I think is becoming a bit more mainstream in the discourse around housing, with related to the increasing corporate investor ownership of housing, really reflects the tension between the profit motive of corporate owners of housing and the objectives of ordinary households to seek shelter and to have a platform for building their life, their family, and existing in a like a thriving, vibrant community. So even if homeowners are investors in their housing, right? There are also people who use these places as shelter, right? It provides a really fundamental need, but also is important for people being able to have um, a high quality of life and living in dignity, right? And so financialization of housing as this concept help us think about these things in tension. And more people are using this term or aware of this term precisely because there has been an increase in corporate investor ownership, particularly of small residential properties, single family homes in particular, following the housing market bust, foreclosure crisis, and recession, all kind of coming out of the late aughts across the country. And there are multiple complex reasons for why corporate investors at that moment really began to launch their large rental home companies and large scale investment. And just a few of the important factors are one, you had banks and financial institutions repossessing large numbers, tens of thousands and more of single family homes across the country, particularly in places that were heavily impacted by speculative home building, subprime mortgage lending. And you had new regulation coming into correct for the more permissive underwriting of mortgages that was happening in the 90s and into the aughts. So it was harder for prospective home buyers to be able to purchase a home. It was harder to access credit. People were lost jobs and hours because of the recession, right? The construction industry, the floor fell out there. And you had institutional investors writ large. You had private equity firms. You had other large investment firms that needed an alternative investment vehicle after all of those financial products that were related to subprime mortgage lending and securitization went away after the burst of the bubble. So it's this kind of perfect storm, if you want to think about it that way, of there being a large supply of single family homes, right? In the before times, before the foreclosure crisis, the way the story often goes is there are so-called mom and pop landlords who, like small proprietors, right? Folks who might have inherited the house, or who maybe are renting the first home that they owned, right? Or the last home that they lived in. Folks that are renting homes often to people that they know. They're using the revenue to supplement their retirement savings in many cases, not trying to push the rents to the edge of the market, right? So a really important distinction between the kind of rental home situation that existed before the foreclosure crisis and the dynamics that we see following the foreclosure crisis as we see these new large institutional profit maximizing actors enter this space kind of en masse. And some of these companies, people watching this interview might be familiar with names like Invitation Homes, which was the rental home company that was created by the Blackstone Group, American Homes for Rent, Tricon Residential. These are the largest of these actors in the single family rental market. And there's been a good deal of research, including by myself, looking at what are the effects of ownership by these types of corporate investors. And there are strong and at least suggestive findings showing that these entities are indeed increasing rents, right, to market or even above market in some cases. So there's a lot of discussion now about the monopoly effect of these institutions collectively being able to set and increase rents in the markets where they control a large share of the rental homes and markets. There are also rampant complaints of deficient property maintenance, right? These companies have large and geographically dispersed portfolios, and they're often not they're attended to the cost of maintenance, et cetera, so forth. So a situation where the business structure might not lend itself to attending to the habitability issues where they occur in properties in a timely fashion. And also, and this is where I've done work, is looking at evictions on these properties. And so eviction filing rates are substantially elevated on properties owned by these corporate investors. And that's related to the fact that they are automating their process for handling delinquencies, automatically filing for eviction at the first opportunity in order to add additional fees to the tenant and to, really nudge the tenant into paying the rent. So they use eviction not directly as a tool for removing tenants, but as a way to increase their collections. And so for a variety of reasons, there's a great deal of concern about the effect of these investors in markets. And additionally, they're making it difficult to compete for starter homes in suburban communities for folks who are looking to purchase. So this is, I think, the kind of broad outlines of this discourse around financialization and corporate owners of single family homes. There's been an increase in corporate ownership writ large, like through and since the pandemic as well. Low interest rates were also another reason why it was really easy for these investors to buy homes with really cheap credit. But I do also want to point out, and I think this is important for where we're going to go in this conversation, that corporate ownership is a really broad category. And so understandably, people are very concerned with and focused on the largest of these institutional investors. But people who have long held rental properties are increasingly using limited liability companies to hold their properties. And so some of the shifts in the share of properties owned by corporate investors can reflect just changing legal structure or the business model of landlords who have long held properties in urban markets. And so it's a really broad category. And through the work that we're doing, I think we're trying to, be really careful and not painting owners of properties who are using a limited liability company with a broad brush stroke about the effects and get at some of the nuance about really who is it that owns these properties and where. And so New Jersey has not really been a place that people have looked at related to this conversation about corporate ownership, specifically of small residential properties. Invitation Homes, they're really big actors. We're busy buying homes in the Sun Belt, like Atlanta is the #1 metro. And that's because those properties there all fit in their buy box. These are like 2,000-foot square homes, single family detached in relatively high performing school districts where there are very strong housing market fundamentals of rent appreciation, population growth, and lax regulation in terms of tenant protections and other things like that. And where precisely where you could buy a large chunk of a suburban subdivision all in one shot at a heavy discount. That isn't the context in New Jersey. But some of our colleagues at Rutgers Newark, at Climb have looked at places like Newark. They looked at Newark specifically and found that actually there has been in recent years an increase in corporate investor ownership, including some private equity firms in the 1 to 4 family housing market space. And Will, myself, and Professor Kathy Newman have also been working on a broader project related to rental housing insecurity across the entire state. And we have heard from folks working in the housing space that corporate investor ownership has made it harder for people to find housing using housing choice vouchers. And so we view this as an opportunity to look in and across the state of New Jersey beyond Newark at what were the trends, what were we seeing, and who are the actors.
Yeah, that's super helpful, just general context, and then kind of nicely zooming in on New Jersey and why New Jersey is of interest in this study. So for this study, you looked at, I think, 7 municipalities in New Jersey. What places did you look at, and how did you pick them? What made them appealing study subjects?
Yeah, so we selected these municipalities in partnership with community organizations that we've been working with in our broader research on rental housing in New Jersey. So we wanted to capture the full range of housing market dynamics that exist in the state. So a lot of people may know New Jersey is the most densely populated state in the nation, but it has within it a huge array of kinds of communities. So everything from inner ring suburbs, you can be in downtown Manhattan in 10 minutes from Jersey City on the PATH train. That's a very different context than rural South Jersey, more agricultural areas like Millville, one of the municipalities we studied. So we thought it was important to kind of, to paraphrase Walt Whitman, to sing the song of Jersey, to really kind of get to the wholeness of the state and look at these different kinds of housing market dynamics and pressures. So we were looking at several high-cost communities in North Jersey, especially those that are commutable to New York City. So Montclair and West New York, of the 7 that we looked at, fall in that category. We also looked at some places with weaker housing market conditions and a little bit more of that kind of post boom and bust bubble dynamic. So looking at Millville in South Jersey, and then Phillipsburg, interestingly, on the border with Pennsylvania on the Delaware River. So that's right across the river from Easton, Pennsylvania. So that's a kind of post-industrial area. They had a lot of kind of large manufacturing firms there. Crayola is still there on the Pennsylvania side, but a lot of the Jersey side, those big factory jobs are gone. There are now more kind of logistics warehouses, Amazon warehouses, hubs like that, but the number of jobs is much lower. And there's also been a dynamic of increased interest in some of this as a kind of super commute location. The Lehigh Valley in Pennsylvania is kind of a super cute commute to New York City. So it has a different thing going on. And in addition to places like that, we also wanted to capture the shore dynamic. So one of the things people know most about New Jersey is the Jersey Shore. And that is a great asset, but it also comes with some complicated dynamics. So a place like Asbury Park. So this is a seaside town with a very long history of segregation. So this is a place that, colleagues from Rutgers and elsewhere have talked about the kind of color line on the beach at Asbury Park. And just residentially, it's a town that the other side of the tracks, the railroad tracks, were a white and black community dividing line for many years. And so what we see there is a lot of recent redevelopment. It's been a lot of money has gone into rebuilding kind of around the boardwalk, the downtown areas, including some very, very high-end condo developments, places with prices above, I think $2 million for penthouses. Don't quote me on that, but it's very, very high prices for being not that close to a central city. And then we finally wanted to talk about some of the post-industrial thriving immigrant hubs, so kind of blue collar hubs that we're not necessarily thinking of as downtrodden, but kind of a striving city. So places like Passaic and then New Brunswick, where I'm speaking to you today from. So New Brunswick is a really fascinating town, and one that we wanted to really capture what made it so interesting from a rental market perspective. So New Brunswick actually has the second highest rentership rate in the whole state. New Jersey has 564 municipalities in it, and the only one that has a higher rental percentage is Harrison, across the river from Newark. And that's mostly kind of new build. They've got the Red Bull soccer arena there. They've got the light rail stop. So that's kind of what's going on in New Brunswick. And so you've really got two populations that make it such a rental hub. You have Rutgers. Yeah, you have our student population, which is a huge part of the city. So students, perennial renters, also kind of attractive to landlords that you get a new population of people in every few years. So they're able to kind of respond to market dynamics pretty quickly. And I think we've seen a lot of corporate interest in those parts of the city. We can talk about that a little bit later. But there's certain kinds of, a limited liability corporation, it's right there in the name. It limits the landlord's liability. If there's damages to the house, if there's, parties that get out of control, things that happen, it kind of insulates the owner from some of those consequences. So the other big part of the renter population in New Brunswick is, as I mentioned, the kind of large immigrant community, which over the decades, New Brunswick has been a kind of gateway for people from all over the world. Post-World War II, there was a huge Hungarian American population, came after the Budapest Uprising. More recently, it's been increasingly Latin America, Mexico, Central America. And so these are communities where there's a lot of demand, and there's not necessarily always the same kind of awareness of and or willingness to enforce some of the housing rights that do exist. So there's been a lot of effort in New Brunswick community organizations to make sure that people know about tenant protections that they are entitled to, and know about some of the efforts. Because as Eric mentioned, New Jersey is a fairly high, within the US at least, in terms of tenant protections, things about, eviction protections, kind of formal proceedings, et cetera. So that's sort of in a nutshell. I don't want to get too deep in every single community, but we really try to get the depth and breadth of some of the things we're seeing in the state.
Yeah, that's really helpful context. It sounds like you are really intentional in picking the study sites in order to kind of get representations of a number of scenarios that play out in different places across the state. So that makes a lot of sense. Can you talk about how you actually conducted the research study? What data were you using? What questions were you seeking to answer? The financialization of housing is a huge topic, so obviously you had to narrow it. So how did you do that?
So we took advantage of the Mod 4 historical database that is maintained here at Rutgers by the Blaustein Local Government Research Center that gave us access to historical tax parcel data going back to, we started our research looking at 2010. So for every year, we can see who receives a tax bill for every given 1 to 4 unit property in all of these different municipalities that we're studying. And so we wanted to understand how many properties are owned by a corporate investor, and I'll talk in a minute about, how you identify that and how that's changed over time, and what are the spatial patterns and the associations with key housing market and demographic variables. And so in order to identify a corporate investor, we're using a broad definition, looking at entities that have what I'll call a corporate identifier in the owner's name in the tax parcel data. So if there's an LLC, an LP, any of these variety of forms of non-individual ownership that we can see in those records that would indicate to us that this is corporate ownership. We had to do some additional work to tease out properties are owned by banks, financial institutions, government entities, major nonprofits, et cetera, so forth. So it takes a good amount of time to perform the quality assurance that you need to make sure that you're getting the records you want and not a lot of false positives. And so we use that process, that kind of iterative process, to identify the corporate owners in the tax parcels. And we looked at change from 2010 to 2022. So we could look at the broad change from the kind of period before the peak of the foreclosure crisis in New Jersey, and then ownership sort of after the peak of the pandemic. I mean, 2022 was the most recent data that we had access to. So I think it gives us a really good bookends for these like really momentous periods in New Jersey and in the country, and for understanding changes wrought by the financialization of housing. And so we looked at some not fancy statistical associations, but really like looking at maps. And so where are corporate owners identified? And I'll tee this over to Will in a moment, who's the cartography expert here. But looking at what are the spatial associations between where we see high or increasing levels of corporate investor ownership, and where do we also see histories of high cost mortgage lending. So we also used data, HMDA data, Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data, that contains loan level records at the census tract level about the cost and type of mortgages. So we can look back at that historically. Laura Nolan, who's a doctoral student at the Blaustein School, who is really, really wickedly clever in working this data, helped us bring that into the mix. We also used historical deed data, transaction data, to look at where there were mortgage foreclosures, right, where there were share sales. And so we wanted to see where were these patterns of problematic and high cost mortgage lending, property repossession by financial institutions, and how they're related in space to patterns of corporate ownership. And then, of course, we looked at the demographic characteristics, particularly looking at the racial and ethnic composition of the neighborhoods, so that we could see where are the places where that were long, perhaps majority minority, historically Black, and we see increases in corporate ownership, and how might these changes be related to each other over time.
Yeah, so just picking up on that, one of the things that came out recently when we were embarking on this project was that the statewide New Jersey Department of Community Affairs, or DCA, had been looking at corporate ownership at a municipal level across the state. So they had a really interesting report there. And so when we were starting our project, we thought part of what we might bring to the table that's new, in addition to kind of refining our methodology and using slightly different data sources, as Eric mentioned, is looking at the within municipality patterns and really trying to get into as much granular detail as we could to help people on the ground understand changes happening in their communities. And so with that, we wanted to kind of strike a balance between privacy protection and kind of understanding the nuances of a market without just kind of putting dots on a map and saying this, first of all, because there's possibilities that, we misidentify something, or that the data is out of date. This all depends on the tax assessor data being perfect. So we wanted to avoid that possibility, but give people a sense of overall trends. And so as a geographer by training and a cartographer, I naturally look to different ways to kind of aggregate and interpolate these patterns in ways that are easier to understand. So the direction I took for that in this project was basically borrowed from things like meteorology and elevation maps, even hiking maps. So I used a kind of contour mapping. And so what that does is basically takes points in space, in this case, a point referring to a corporate owned 1 to 4 unit residential property. And what it does is that every cell in a kind of very large grid over a whole town, every cell, it'll look around, the computer will look, and it would say within a quarter mile, how many investor owned properties are there? So what that's doing is creating a kind of surface, a data surface that says there's higher concentration here, lower concentration here. So this is called a kernel density map. It's kind of a common technique. And then what you can do, because, okay, now you've got this, bright colors here, dark colors here, you can't really see much else. And so you can extract out of that lines that show the borders between a place that has 10 corporate properties within a quarter mile, a place that has 20, 30, 40, 50, et cetera. So this is where the analogy to something like a hiking map comes. You know that a steep hill is going to be represented by these concentric elevation contours. And so we use the same visual approach and kind of data visualization approach to corporate housing. So for example, in a city like New Brunswick, you can look at the area near the College Avenue campus of Rutgers, which I can almost see from my office right here. And you can see that some of the highest concentrations of corporate ownership of 1 to 4 unit housing occur in direct proximity to the campus, to some of the kind of fraternity and sorority areas over on that side of the city. But you also, without sacrificing detail there, you can see changes over time. We looked at 2 time slices, 2010 and 2022. And so you can see that in other parts of the city, so the kind of Unity Square and Esperanza neighborhoods and the kind of southeast portion of New Brunswick, there were also huge increases in corporate owned 1 to 4 units between those 2 time periods. So it was an approach to mapping that allowed us to focus on both where do we see hotspots, where do we see the most, without necessarily giving up that ability to differentiate between kind of places that hadn't seen a whole lot of financialized housing, to be quite honest. And in more recent decades, post-COVID, et cetera, we're starting to feel that. So that's what we did. As Eric mentioned, we also looked at demographic data, both the plurality, racial and ethnic group within each census block group. We wanted to understand within cities, what are the kind of predominant social mix here, and how is that affecting these patterns? And then we also looked at those changes over time. And what you can see in places like Asbury Park and Montclair, to name 2 of our cities, is that as rents go up, as housing prices go up, you see 2 things happening in tandem. You see more corporate investment in properties that were historically African American, and to a lesser extent, Latinx, Latino. You see more corporate investment, and you also see a decrease in the African American share of the population in those groups. So if you look in our report, you can see a real shrinking effect in especially Montclair and Asbury Park, as areas that had been home to a kind of vibrant African American community were really kind of besieged on many sides by the real estate market and some of those contours. One thing to keep in mind is that this doesn't play out evenly for everybody. It could actually work very much to the benefit of individual homeowners to sell their house in an appreciating market. Maybe they retire somewhere else. So this isn't to say that these forces are completely unidirectional, but more to kind of illustrate the sort of aggregate effect of some of these changes.
Wow. Okay. So methodologically, pretty sophisticated. You got to get over the activation energy of even finding what properties are corporately owned, which is obviously hard to do, right? Because they're not compelled. There's no field in your data that's going to tell you whether this is an individual or corporate owner, and then bringing together a variety of other types of data to really look at what's happening. It sounds like in terms of findings, that one of the kind of top of the fold ones was you were seeing parts of communities that had historically been occupied by BIPOC residents that were seeing an influx of corporate owners, and the renters who were then occupying the units tended to be white. Is that one of the findings that you had?
That's
Or
a
more
little bit
white?
more granular than we can say with this particular data. I
Okay.
think the correlations are moving in the same directions as you outlined, but because of some of these privacy protections, we can tell in a census block group that the share of African American residents went from 37% to 25%. And we
Mhm.
can tell that the number of corporate owned 1 to 4 unit properties went from 5 to 30. We can't
Mhm.
necessarily tell you the racial ethnic identity, nor should we, of the people living in those rentals. But I think this is a case where working with our community partners and being able to kind of share data and share findings kind of helps sort of, to excuse the pun, illuminate the contours of the issue. And then obviously people on the ground are going to have much more knowledge about locally what kind of things are indeed happening. But if this is a way to kind of bring a broader context and bring awareness to those trends, I think that's for the better.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. No, I understand the sort of limitations and what you can say at the unit of analysis that, sort of a community or a part of a community. It sounds like generally speaking, the trends look a little bit like that. Were there other findings that were important in this work, either that you had that sort of aligned with what was already known in the literature or maybe were surprising to you?
Well, I think that there's some surprise that there is such an increase in corporate investor ownership in New Jersey, right? A place that has not really been the source of research previously, where much of the attention has gone to the Sun Belt and those other markets where those big name investors have been particularly active. So in New Brunswick, for instance, we saw an increase from about 7% corporate investor ownership in 2010 to 20% in 2022. And we saw a similar increase in Asbury Park. So really substantial increases at the municipal level. And so Will mentioned the report from Department of Community Affairs. And so if you're looking at these municipal level trends as they did, that pattern is known from that report, right? Really like the first look at what's happening across a number of communities in the state. But if you look at Montclair, for instance, the aggregate share of properties owned by corporate investors is low. It's below 5%, and it's only increased modestly. But if you look at specific neighborhoods, particularly the Fourth Ward, historically Black community below Bay Street Station, you see substantial increases. So looking within communities at specific neighborhoods, knowing that not all municipalities are homogenous, right? I'm still trying to get my head around all these different communities in New Jersey. So many of them. Some places are very small and kind of all of a piece, and some have many different housing submarkets within them. And so that's been illuminating. I think that the findings do track broadly with research about where investors writ large are buying properties or targeting properties. They're targeting relatively lower cost properties in communities that are more diverse. And by more diverse, I mean not majority white in many cases, places where you do have at least a modest BIPOC community representation. Um, you see also the impact of foreclosures. And so this is something that's known from existing research as well, that really direct relationship between foreclosure, repossession, and then sale to a corporate investor. And places with very high foreclosure rates and in those neighborhoods with very high foreclosure rates, for instance, in New Brunswick, extremely high foreclosure rates in the broader Unity and Unity Square and Esperanza neighborhood, right? We could look at the deeds data and we didn't get too far into this in the analysis because we only have so many hours in the day, but we could see that there were those direct transactions from the county sheriff to those corporate investors. And foreclosure occurred a little bit later in New Jersey, or at the peak of the foreclosure crisis, a little bit later in New Jersey, around 2016, 2017, compared to the sales of properties more around 2011, 2012 that happened in parts of the Sun Belt. So even though sometimes the foreclosure crisis seems like the ancient past, it's actually pretty recent history in New Jersey. So tracking those dynamics is really important. So a really important story of commonality or similarity with other research, but divergence in terms of like the temporality and the fact that it's happening in New Jersey.
I think we also saw something about the geography of ownership And that across all 7, we found that most corporate owners did not have mailing addresses in the same municipality as their holdings. And so it's not necessarily what Eric was talking about earlier of, oh, I used to live in the downstairs and now I live upstairs, and this person is just, making a tenant to kind of make rent, make my mortgage payment. So we found there's a lot of kind of intra New Jersey cross municipal lines ownership. But we did not see a very large out of state ownership network. So compared to things like the Sun Belt, where there's a lot of large national institutional investors, even international, we didn't really see a lot of that. And of the out of state owners, they were predominantly in Pennsylvania and New York. And if you know one thing about the geography of New Jersey is that we are a state sandwiched between the Philadelphia metro area and the New York metro area. And so it makes a lot of sense that, especially in places like Phillipsburg is right on the border with Pennsylvania. You have, Passaic is not too far from the New York border, West New York, Montclair. There's a lot of kind of regional ownership relations. So we didn't see a huge kind of far off effect. One thing we did note is that the 3 of the 7 case study municipalities we looked at, New Brunswick, Millville, and Phillipsburg, all had the highest rates of ownership outside of that municipality. And they also all have the lowest housing costs. And this is maybe an obvious finding on some level, but it tracks with this idea of people are trying to buy low and sell high, and that not necessarily living in these communities. So there's a lot of ownership that's kind of at that kind of regional state level scale.
And I'll just add one more point too about the scale of the holdings of any individual landlord, is that we did not see, even if they were based in Pennsylvania or New York, we did not see, or locally, very investors who had very large inventories, with a few exceptions that we did see in some communities, that there were individual landlords, though locally based entities based in jurisdictions that are just a short drive away, who did own dozens, or in some cases, more than 50 properties in those locations. And this is, often, what I've seen in my research in places like Detroit, where you have investors who leverage local knowledge, people who maybe have a relationship with the local real estate industry, maybe realtors themselves, who are able to, kind of take advantage of those knowledge networks in order to build their own rental inventory portfolios.
And the picture would probably look quite different if we were looking at larger multifamily properties in the state. So that's one important caveat, that we're not looking at buildings with 40 units or 100 units or 200 units. So that kind of, large building investor relation is kind of out of scope here. We were looking at these, whether it's single family or what's very common in New Jersey, you have houses that maybe in the Victorian era were single family and then became subdivided into 2 or 4. Actually, what we found, kind of an interesting little finding in Asbury Park, the northwestern part of Asbury Park has a lot of these houses that started as kind of grand mansions and then became small multifamily. Many of those are now being reconverted back to single family homes. And this kind of tracks with a de-densification narrative that's been quite common in cities as kind of birth rates go down, and a lot of the kind of financialization of housing, and also just sort of general affluence in places like New York City. I think I saw something the other day that Chicago now has more households than it ever has, but far from its peak population, because there are just fewer people living in each house. And so when we think of the kind of paradox of scarcity in a place that has, so many millions of housing units, part of it is lifestyles have changed, and the kind of even just the geometry of like, what is a housing unit? How many people live in it? How has it been arranged in space has changed quite a bit, even in our study area.
So I just had a detailed question. So, we talked a little bit about identifying corporate owners because it's not explicit in the tax records. And then you're talking about, a very small number of owners owning multiple properties, that mostly it's a one-to-one. How were you tracking, how were you identifying those owners who had multiples? Was it by mailing address, or how did you know, like, oh, this is the same owner for these different properties?
That's a great question, and it's something that makes us really kind of have to reveal the nitty-gritty of how this work is done. And so we are two people among kind of a larger community of researchers in academia and beyond who are looking at these questions in other places. So we, consulted the other folks who have been doing work like this, and like what are the best practices of leveraging imperfect data that only partially gives you a partial glimpse into these things. And so we did use the mailing address for the tax bill, but we because addresses can be entered differently in the same place or elsewhere, we made our best effort to create what some folks call an address token. So extracting all of the sort of distinct and less likely to be erroneously entered items like the street number, the PO box, and elements like that, so that we could identify kind of a cleaner, standardized address field across all of them and look at how many properties are owned by entities with that same address token. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right. This is imperfect. And so we're not going to have precise counts for everybody, but I think it's, better than, it's some information that we're using in the absence of no information about this.
Yeah,
I
no,
think for
I just love those kind of details of how the research was done. Sorry, Will, you were saying something?
No, no, no. And for the population that we're looking at, we didn't see a ton of evidence of kind of deliberate obfuscation of kind of layers upon layers of shell companies and things like that. That's kind of a feature of this sort of work, a kind of forensic accounting approach. If you're looking at, for example, pied-à-terres in New York City and London, and you're trying to figure out, which billionaire oligarch owns this particular penthouse, that's happening less so at the kind of the sub-market we're looking at. But a lot of data input is sloppy and inconsistent, and sometimes people put South Street and sometimes they put South Ave even though it's street, or sometimes West 10th Street, 10th Street West, just all of these things that can happen. And Eric and I have seen probably every permutation of spelling error. One of the best things actually is, in New Jersey, there's not even consensus on what towns are called. So people can live in a census designated place or a kind of small community within a larger township. And sometimes the mail goes to the name of the community. Sometimes it goes to the name of the township. It's really kind of a free for all sometimes. So we've had to, through some of our research more broadly about rental housing in New Jersey, we've learned some tips and tricks for figuring out whether, what's changed between these two pictures. And sometimes all that's changed is, who's writing the mailing address.
We did some work, gosh, a couple of years ago on LLCs in New York City. And so when you were talking about oligarchs and trying to pull back the veil on who's actually doing what, yeah, we went through the ringer on that. And you do the best you can. And yes, you come up with some hacks and some like, this appears to be the trend. Let me try to apply this logic, kind of methodologies. So the findings sound really important, and they sound like the kind of findings that should have some sort of policy implications. Have you thought through what those policies might look like? What policymakers should be thinking about based on what you're seeing in these data?
Sure. So the first thing that comes to my mind, because I'm always thinking about this kind of historical arc and relationship between foreclosure crisis, and investor acquisition, is targeting distressed properties that may be experiencing either mortgage foreclosure or property tax foreclosure, which also occurs in the state. They go through different processes. And so how can you target this inventory where there is often a governmental or regulatory body involved, like as an intermediary, that could potentially be identified as a lever for directing those properties into ownership by non-for-profit or even governmental entities that can then use them for lower moderate income home ownership or rental housing opportunities. Now that takes a lot of money and capacity to do that, and so there's a state housing trust fund. You could grant additional funding to that. There are efforts in New Brunswick, for instance, to find affordable acquisition opportunities for the community development housing finance agency here to find those properties to use for those purposes. It's just really hard to do because on the open market, properties are really expensive. And so just kind of getting ahead of those trends and identifying those opportunities before they move into corporate investor ownership. And then on the kind of other side of the equation, once they are perhaps in a corporate investor ownership, how can we protect the tenants in those properties? And so an active conversation that's happening is around a tenant's right to counsel. And so while individuals are guaranteed a right to counsel in criminal court, they are not in civil court. And so uh, in eviction hearings, landlords are often represented by an attorney, but tenants seldom are, right? Even in cases where the representation of the claim is in error or false, et cetera. And so being able to support tenants and have them be able to, actually exercise their rights under landlord-tenant law in New Jersey, right? Because we know that the power differential between landlord and tenant is often exploited to the advantage of the landlord.
I think another way to look at this kind of power imbalance and to say one of the benefits, if you will, of a corporate ownership structure is that one step of remove it places between an owner and a tenant, this kind of abstraction through a corporate entity. And so, as we were all mentioning in terms of LLCs and shell companies, there are places that have looked into the beneficial owner disclosure requirements, which would make some of this smoke and mirrors a little bit easier to pierce, whether by people in tenants' rights organizations, whether by researchers, individual tenants themselves, just to give a sense of actually this is a trail that can be followed. Because again, we don't want to paint everyone with the same brush. There's a lot of different actors in these kinds of markets, but you do have to look at this as a kind of shifting of the pendulum towards a tenant having less information, less transparency about just who is kind of owning their unit, and then from policymakers who owns large parts of their cities. This is a kind of public right to know. So there's also things like rental registration that can be part of that, which we've seen actually more effort to do this in things like short-term rentals. So maybe this is kind of the canary in the coal mine where, okay, we're having to register Airbnbs, but could that percolate back into a kind of more long-term leases, so that, municipal officials, organizations can just figure out even what's going on. We've been working on this broader project for a couple of years now. This specific report is a year's worth of effort, and it was complicated and it was hard. And there are definitely things that could have made it a lot easier along the way. The other big one we have to mention, of course, is rent control. And so this is something that on the state level, again, New Jersey is actually in fairly good shape. There are no statewide bans on rent control as exist in many states. And many individual municipalities do have some form of rent control, though, as Dr. Seymour, Dr. Newman, and I, and some other collaborators have looked at, the actual scope of these laws is quite varied, and the way in which these protections persist over time and space. There's things like vacancy decontrol, where depending on how a particular regulation is written, when a tenant leaves an apartment, that can give you the ability to increase prices by a larger amount than you could if they were renewing a tenancy, or it can completely reset the price index. And so the new tenant can come in. Of course, that then creates shifting and we might say bad incentives to evict tenants in order to, create a higher rent floor. So there's a lot. It really, if you think about this as kind of one skirmish in a broader kind of understanding of the rights and responsibilities of different people in the housing market, all of these would be ways of kind of evening the field a little bit, or even just understanding the landscape, which is what we've tried with this report.
And piggybacking on that, rent control often exempts small residential properties. And I think the assumption is there that small residential properties are owned by those, quote unquote, mom and pop, those small proprietors, and we don't want to do damage to their ability to generate some supplemental revenue. But when these properties are owned by large corporate entities, which is not always the case, as our results suggest. However, you should have policy crafted to reflect these broader changing dynamics in rental property ownership.
Yeah. So I hear kind of two strains here. One is to the extent that properties are becoming available through things like tax foreclosures, government should have systems in place to try and put them in the hands of, keep them affordable, not let them fall into corporate hands. And if properties then have protections in place so that that sort of bad landlord behavior is curtailed, basically. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense for New Jersey and elsewhere. So my last question for you is just how does this research continue in the future? I know that this was part of a much larger effort. What's next? What's coming up next?
So we've actually begun a project that's going to take this statewide, looking at corporate investor ownership of all 1 to 4 unit properties. And so this work was really important for us to be able to develop our methodologies, right, for identifying corporate investors, for thinking about how to represent the geography and concentration of corporate investor ownership at different scales, and to also identify the really relevant variables. And so, some of this we can draw on from pre-existing or existing literature, but through the work itself, really getting a sense of what matters in New Jersey at point in time, but also change in time. So we are biting off a big project here because it's just, the more the more counties you add into the mix, the more municipalities, the more possible inconsistencies you have with the data. But our effort is to take this nuanced look at these places that we've generated through this report to produce something that is a higher level, but more putting these places in the context across all municipalities and communities across the state.
I mean, Eric, it's only 557 more municipalities. Like, how hard could that be to just add those to the mix?
Automation is helpful, but doesn't do all of it. And so that's giving us a very partial but important picture on corporate investor ownership, its change in geography across the state, and the types of communities where we see these increases, but we also need to understand the impact of ownership types. And so we weren't able to directly address that, though our findings are suggestive of certain things, which is why I think that it's not difficult for us to make some general recommendations in terms of tenant protections, et cetera. But we need to understand these differences. In some housing markets, for instance, investors could be investing in and providing housing that's available to people who are using housing choice vouchers, which are extremely difficult to use in housing markets. So in places like in South Jersey, for instance, perhaps that's what is happening. And so we don't want to a priori indicate that all corporate investors are participating in some kind of activity of inflating rents and pricing out existing tenants. And so what is the impact of these ownership types and how do they vary across different housing markets? So understanding those effects. And so that's the broader effort that we also want to undertake.
Yeah, that's really, really important details to understand. And I'm sure that some more specific policies could be formulated based on that information. But this is an amazing start on all of that much more expansive work and some really great insights that you've been able to produce with this work.